Hey, good morning, everybody. I understand that today was supposed to be, or is supposed to be, a question and answer session. As I always say, you are free to ask any question. I will not necessarily be able to give you an answer. I make no warranties, but I will try. And we could obviously have follow-up on any particular point. So the ball is in your court, and yeah.
What do you think is the solution to the peace in the Middle East?
Well, the solution is the coming of the Mashiach. On one hand, this is a hopeless situation, but precisely when it is hopeless, you realize that God is going to have to take over. So that is really our ultimate belief. Yeah.
So you mentioned the Mashiach, and
yes.
I've always had some questions about it. So is it a specific person, or just a time, or...
That is an excellent question. So first of all, translation of Mashiach, which is Messiah, it just means the anointed one. And in fact, in the Bible, Mashiach is not always referring to some ultimate person. The high priest could be called Mashiach, a king, any king could be called Mashiach. But typically, the way we use it in the Talmud, we refer to a specific person. And the traditional Jewish belief is that this will be a person who will be descended from King David, and he will establish, he will build the temple, he will ingather the exiles of the Jewish people back to Israel, he will be regarded as a spiritual leader as well, and he will usher in an era of peace and harmony and reconciliation in the world. So we very much do believe in the idea of a personal Mashiach as an emissary of God, although the conservative reform movements have tended to water that down by talking about a messianic age. But we actually do believe in a personal Mashiach. What is fascinating is this. One of our principles of faith is Mashiach can come every day. Now, if Mashiach can come today, that means there is somebody in the world who potentially is the one. What was that phrase in the Matrix? The one. What did they call it? What was Neo? The one, or whatever it is. There is that one. Now, what is even more perplexing is, if Mashiach can come every day, that means Mashiach could have come 100 years ago, could have come 500 years ago, could have come 1,000 years ago. Meaning, in every single generation, God has somebody that God may choose to be the Redeemer. But if we're not worthy, that person lives and dies and may never even know that they were the one. It just goes to somebody else as people die. So if any of you are descended from King David, I'm not sure if you know, you might be the one. You never know. And indeed, we sometimes say that the way you have to treat your fellow Jew is imagine them that they might be the Mashiach, right? You don't know. The person next to you might be the one. So we very much do believe that. And this is based not so much on the Torah, but it's based on passages in the book of Isaiah and the prophetic books and the like. Yeah.
There's like the Mashiach around like the year like 6,000.
Yeah, so here's an interesting thing. There are many different statements in our tradition about Mashiach. Some of the statements are not consistent. Some of the statements represent individual views as opposed to the official collectivist views. So it's always hard to know what is a definitive statement and what is the particular opinion of a given rabbi. But there is a tradition that is stated that the concept is that just as there were six days of creation followed by a Shabbat, so too world history will consist of 6 millennia, followed by the ushering in of the Messianic era, which will be the Shabbat. And as a result, the belief is that although Mashiach can come any day, but Mashiach will come no later than the year 6000, which is entering the 7th millennia, which will usher in the eternal Shabbat. So if you think about it, we're now in 5,000, in the Jewish calendar, 5,775 years. So we have 225 years left. Again, Mashiach can come early, just like you can make Shabbat early, right? Mashiach can come early, but he will come no later than the year 6000. Now, what's interesting is that is a tradition that is recorded in the Talmud, but when Maimonides summarizes Jewish learning on the Mashiach, Maimonides does not mention that in particular. So it's not 100% clear that that's a definitive part of our tradition. But yes, it's a well-known idea. In fact, one thing about the Jewish calendar, the Jewish calendar, as you know, is a lunar calendar. We base our months on the moon and with a solar adjustment. What do I mean by that? Because 12 lunar revolutions around the Earth is 354 days. The Earth's revolution around the sun, I'm going to go approximate, is 365 and a fourth. We'll go approximate, it's good enough for our purposes. That means a solar year is 11 days longer than a lunar year. That is why a Hebrew date, vis-a-vis an English date, is going to move progressively earlier in the year. So for example, if any given year, let's say, Rosh Hashanah is September 15, next year, Rosh Hashanah will be September 4th. And the year after, it will be in August. In other words, the Hebrew date will get earlier and earlier and earlier because it's 11 days shorter. Now, this is not allowed to go on indefinitely for the following reason. The Torah requires that Passover be in the spring. This is a halacha, that Passover be in the spring. Now, the problem is, in a lunar calendar, that's not going to work. Because if Passover starts off in the spring, the next year it'll be 11 days earlier, and the next year 11 days earlier, and the next year 11 days earlier. It's eventually going to be in the winter. So the way the Jewish calendar compensates, I'm going to get back to the Messiah. You'll see how this is connected. It's a bit of a long digression. The way this is going to happen is that 7 out of 19 years, we add an extra month to the Jewish calendar. That's the second month of Adar. That pushes Passover later into the year. So when Passover gets too early and it's not going to be in the spring, the Jewish calendar is adjusted by a push forward. So we are a combination of a lunar calendar with what is called a solar intercalation so that they match up. As opposed, for example, to the Islamic calendar. The Islamic calendar is a 100% lunar calendar without a solar adjustment. And that is why Ramadan, which is the month-long fast, will indeed be 11 days earlier every year. And you can have Ramadan in the winter or the summer or the fall. It goes through the entire year. Now, that makes a lot of sense because Ramadan is supposed to be in the summer, but if I was a Muslim, I would much rather have a winter fast. It's cooler and the day is shorter and the like. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is that the Jewish calendar is a very, very intricate computation of solar adjustments and lunar calculations, and all the holidays are based on this. But the calendar was put into effect only until the year 6000, because the belief is that by the year 6000, there'll be the Messiah, there'll be the Sanhedrin, and we will go back to witnesses testifying about the new moon, and we're not going to use calendars. And so the confidence in the Mashiach was so strong that there is no Jewish calendar after the year 6000, because we're going to figure we're going to have the Sanhedrin handle it. Now that would mean, as a theoretical possibility, this is very funny, that if God forbid the Mashiach wouldn't come, which again, we believe that he is going to come, but if he wouldn't come, we would no longer have Jewish holidays after the year 6000, except for Shabbos. Shabbos does not depend on a calendar. There would not be Rosh Hashanah, there would not be Passover, there would not be Yom Kippur, meaning the entire Jewish holiday cycle would lapse upon the year 6000 because there's no calendar and there's no Mashiach, right? So I'm just bringing this very long example just to underscore the fact that the belief in the Mashiach was so strong that they actually put an expiration date in the Jewish calendar in reliance that Mashiach is going to be here and handle it. Okay? Yeah?
Why don't we have a Shabbat every 6 hours or every 6 months or every 6 years or every 60 years or every 600 years?
Yeah, well, that is a good question, but once again, we are paralleling the creation cycle. Now, although it is true, as we discussed, that the particular length of a day may not have been 24 hours then, but still, the way the Torah describes it, there is a cycle of creation of 6 days, followed by a day of rest, and therefore the Shabbat cycle mirrors that. Now, there is one exception. In fact, that's relevant to this year. There is in the land of Israel a Shabbat year every 7 years, and that is called the Shemitah year. I don't know if you've noticed it here, but in this year, which is a Shemitah year, a religious farmer does not farm his land, lets the land lie fallow and the like, and that is called in the Torah, not just by the word Shemitah, it is actually called the Shabbat of the land. So you do have that cycle. But in terms of our own Shabbat, it's simply a question of following the rhythms of creation. And many people have pointed out that this is actually almost instinctual. You know, one of the things that Stalin wanted to do, Stalin wanted to totally uproot religious consciousness in the Soviet Union. So he understood that people needed vacation. But he didn't like this idea that every 7 days you take a break. Whether it's Sunday or Saturday makes a difference. That connects you to the Shabbat cycle. So he wanted to create a work week of 9 days, a decimal system. You work for 9 days and you rest the 10th day. Because he wanted to kind of get rid of the Shabbat consciousness in the human personality. And that didn't work. Apparently there is something cyclical that is embedded in our personalities, connected to 6 followed by 7, and that goes back to God's original cycle of creation. Yeah.
Change of pace, I guess.
Yeah.
For better or worse, modernism has appended a lot of traditional forms of thinking on everything from politics to art and literature to morality, religion, science. What developments in modern society do you think Judaism has left underexamined? And what, if any, aspects of modernism worry you the most?
Well, let me just address the second point first, then I'll go back. I think the most dangerous aspect of modernism is the notion of relativism of morality, the concept that there are no ultimate values, there are no fundamental truths, everything is a matter of environmental conditioning, and all truths are relative. And this can be a very, very horrendous thing. I remember reading that a group of Jewish high school students, just Jewish high school students, they were discussing the Holocaust. And one of the students just said, I know that it's not a nice thing, but from the perspective of the Germans and their philosophy, what was wrong with what they did? This was consistent with their philosophical premises. In other words, a person can reach a stage in which the genocide of a nation is just a matter of taste, right? So that's a very, very dangerous idea. Now, I will admit to you that sometimes what anyone proclaims as an ultimate value might in fact be subjective, and sometimes a person might be taking a preference and elevating it to a value, and that's a risk in and of itself. But the denial that there is a bedrock of fundamental morality is a very, very dangerous idea that creates tremendous suffering as well as estrangement from God, the ultimate source of morality. So I think that is very dangerous. And by the way, people sometimes blame Einstein because of relativity, but the truth is relativity and relativism are two different things just because they have the same letters. And in fact, Einstein himself, number one, he was a very moral person, but besides that, even scientifically, he believed in kind of a unified foundation. He did not believe in chaos, anarchy, and subjectivity. He believed in a very structured universe, even scientifically. That is why he rejected many aspects of quantum mechanics for that reason. Okay. Now, let me introduce to you an idea that's a very, very explosive, revolutionary idea, at least within Orthodoxy. And many people would not accept it, but I just want to throw it out just so you would understand that great, great Jewish minds who are totally committed to the Torah have grappled with this. And that is, you may have heard of the first chief rabbi, not of the state of Israel because he died before there was a state, but the first chief rabbi of Palestine, as it was called. And this was the great Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Kook, Rav Kook. Rav Kook was a great, great scholar of Torah and a great righteous man. But Rav Kook was controversial both in his lifetime and even to this very day. He's very controversial. In fact, in our own yeshiva, there are many rabbis who will not talk about Rav Kook's teachings because they are controversial. But I want to share something with you because one of Rav Kook, what was so controversial about Rav Kook? Well, number one, he was a tremendous lover of Israel. Unfortunately, that's a controversial idea sometimes. But in particular, although he himself was totally righteous and observant, he befriended and collaborated and gave strength and encouragement to the Zionists who were building up the land, even though many of them were atheists, many of them did not believe in God, and many of them were actually anti-Torah. And many religious Jews said, forget about them, have nothing to do with them. And he believed that it was important to foster connections, even with non-believers. And this stemmed from a mystical aspect of his philosophy. It was not simply a feel-good, let's love everybody and sing Kumbaya. But he believed that sometimes spiritually powerful ideas have to come into the world through nefarious means. We could describe this as a sheep in wolf's clothing. Right? You know the expression, a wolf in sheep's clothing. That's when something bad is disguised as something good. Rav Kook made the point that sometimes there is something good that needs to be disguised as something bad. Why is that so? Because based on Kabbalah, he taught there are certain powers of evil and negativity in the world that prevents holiness from emerging. So the holiness must go under the radar in the guise of impurity. But within that impurity, there's a holy spark. Now, he saw secular Zionism in that way, that externally, there were so many aspects of it that were against Judaism. Many people had a denial of God. They were not keeping the Shabbat. They made fun of religion even. But the idea of rebuilding the land was so holy and so sacred that the powers of impurity wouldn't let it in unless it looked like it was also impure. So based on this, Rav Kook said, there are many developments that superficially are inimical to Torah, but in fact contain sparks of insight and holiness that can rejuvenate Judaism. Now, this is a deep, profound, controversial, and complex idea of how Judaism relates to modernity. Because whether it's feminism, whether it's multiculturalism, whatever your development is, one's initial reaction might be, I look at this stuff and I say, treif, not kosher, no good. Push it away. But Rav Kook is suggesting that hidden under many layers is kind of a morality that is emerging that needs to find a way to be incorporated within traditional Judaism without, God forbid, undermining it. I'm not sure if I'm making sense to you, but this is Rav Kook's idea, and it is quite a revolutionary idea, and don't quote me on this, I don't want to get in trouble across the street, but I'm simply telling it to you because I'm getting the feeling that this is part of what you're grappling with, and you need to know that within the tradition there are voices that are grappling with this idea.
Do you have any specific examples of certain things that you think are sheep in wolf's clothing?
Yeah. For example, many aspects of feminism are clearly antagonistic to the Torah. Like the women rabbis. I can go through all sorts of things. Because the reason is not because, God forbid, women are inferior. That's absolutely, in fact, this deserves a talk of its own. Men and women are equal in God's eyes. But Judaism very much believes that equality of dignity is not sameness of function. Men and women do have different talents. They do have different abilities. They look at the world in different ways. The very enrichment of the man-woman relationship is precisely because they are different. And attempts to blindly obliterate barriers and no longer recognize difference is not enhancing dignity. It's ultimately undermining it because it basically says the value of a woman is to the degree she could be a man. So on one hand, we can look at feminism and say, no good, as many people do. On the other hand, Rav Kook says, the struggle for human dignity and respect is a fundamentally good value and a holy value, even if it manifests itself in improper ways. Or the idea like this: the Torah allows for slavery. We have to admit this. Now, it is very, very true that the Torah humanizes slavery much more than any other ancient culture, right? The Torah does say you have to treat your slaves with dignity and respect, so it's certainly a great improvement, and we never should forget that. But the Torah is not an abolitionist document, that much we have to say. And in fact, there were some American rabbis, some, not most, who actually used the biblical institution of slavery to oppose the Emancipation Proclamation at the time of the American Civil War. Because they argued, hey, God says slavery is okay. But Rav Kook basically said that there are things the Torah tolerated because that was the nature of man in society at the time. But man can also undergo spiritual metamorphosis, that there is kind of continuing revelations, that God brings us to higher moral sensibilities. And although that sometimes turns into violence, revolution, anarchy, looting, like black riots or whatever it is, and all sorts of things that are wrong and immoral, but in the core, there is a struggle for human dignity, which is a revelation from God about the direction of society. Right, so that's kind of examples of this. So whether it's feminism, whether it's the elimination of racial discrimination barriers, these are kind of ways that God is pushing us to achieve higher moral consciousness. Now, there is a contradiction here, because we do have another teaching in our tradition that the generations get inferior as we get further and further from Sinai. And yet at the same time, there are going to be new awarenesses and new consciousness that is part of God's continuing revelation. So it cannot contradict the Torah, but it can allow for an incorporation within the Torah of certain understandings. Polygamy is another example. The Torah permits polygamy. The Talmud permits polygamy. And yet we know that Rabbi Gershom, one of the greatest of the German rabbis in the 11th century, prohibited polygamy. Once again, how could, if the Torah says it's okay, why is he saying it's not okay? Well, the answer once again is that we move to a certain level and then morality has to respond. But again, I want to point out that this is a very, very dangerous idea, and it's sometimes used irresponsibly. In fact, most of the time it's used irresponsibly. That's why we often don't even talk about this, because people use it to replace the Torah, to supersede the Torah, to say the Torah no longer applies. That is heresy. That is against the Jewish belief. That is totally against what it means to be a follower of God. So we're not talking about replacing the Torah. We're just talking about, as it were, things that the Torah didn't mandate, but it may have permitted, that can change with the evolution of moral consciousness. So I guess the short answer is that in life, it's always easy to be a binary person. When I'm confronted with all the stuff from the outside, it's easy to say, yeah, sure, bring it in. And it's easy to say, no, keep it out. But neither of those are totally truthful. The truth is, you got to analyze, you got to think, you got to evaluate. Some is good, some is bad. You got to identify if it's a wolf in sheep's clothing or a sheep in wolf's clothing. What's the sheep and what's the wolf? And that's not so easy. But it is a struggle that we do go through. Yeah.
I was also hoping you could touch on the concept of reincarnation in Judaism.
Yeah. Were you guys in Tzfat? I know some of you were, but...
Briefly.
Okay. So you were in the city of Kabbalah. Let me say a little bit about reincarnation. Reincarnation is not mentioned in the Bible, and it is not mentioned in the Talmud. So as a result, we cannot call it a fundamental principle of Judaism, meaning if I didn't believe in it, I wouldn't be a heretic. But reincarnation was strongly advocated and taught by the Kabbalah, by the mystics, primarily in the city of Tzfat, up north, the Arizal and his students, Rav Chaim Vital. And they very much believed, and again, reincarnation answers a lot of difficult questions, and that is, we say in order to go to paradise, you have to do the commandments. Well, what about all those Jews that died without doing the commandments? Or what about those Jews who it's not even their fault? They never had the education. They never had the background. They never had the exposure. On one hand, they're not going to go to paradise because they don't have the admission ticket. On the other hand, God's not fair. Where's the fairness in not even giving him a chance? So the doctrine of reincarnation was developed to kind of say that you get infinite chances till you make it. Meaning to say, if I didn't succeed in this first life, instead of a soul being condemned to purgatory or hell or something like that, they're simply given another chance in different circumstances to rectify the mistakes of the past life and to achieve their goal. In a way, it's kind of like that movie Groundhog Day, in the sense that you kind of relive the day over and over and over again till you get it right. Even in tests, there are some professors that, at least in some colleges, they actually give you the test over and over and over again until you get 100. I don't know how they grade students if everybody gets 100 eventually, but you're given a test. You start off with a 50. Okay, study and take it again. And you take it again and again and again and again and again till you have 100 because you've mastered the material. So reincarnation was a very, very powerful idea of the Kabbalah because it indicates that God gives you these chances to perfect yourself. However, they did teach that by and large, a person is not aware of their past lives. Now, there is a branch in quasi-psychology, I'm not sure if it's actually considered to be psychologically or scientifically authentic, involving past life regression. There are some books about this, in which under deep hypnosis, people have recalled experiences that seem to be attributed to a prior life. But that's not scientifically conclusive because there are a lot of different ways the brain processes things. So if you were reading a Victorian novel, your brain could process all sorts of images, and under hypnosis, you could actually feel that you experienced that novel as part of your life, or a TV show, or whatever it was. So I'm not going to say there's scientific proof for reincarnation, but there's some anecdotal evidence. But as I say, the Kabbalists anyway never made the claim that you were aware of it. But that is the case. So according to Kabbalah, there are very few new souls. Almost all of us by this time are recycled in one way or the other. So that's it. And in Rav Chaim Vital, who is the Ari's greatest disciple, he actually gives specific great people and who are their reincarnations of. They were able to identify people. I'll give you one striking example. And again, I don't know the source. The Kabbalist just knows this. I don't know how they know this. It's kind of higher knowledge. Do you remember the first murder in the Torah? Right? This is Cain and Abel. Cain murders his brother Abel, Hevel. According to the Ari, Moshe Rabbeinu is a reincarnation of the soul of Hevel, going all the way back, and that is why the word Hevel means breath. Something that's very ephemeral, very transient. And Moshe Rabbeinu is described as the most humble of all people, like Hevel, almost like he felt he was nothing. So that's why there's that spiritual connection. So that's kind of it. There are some books, good Jewish books on Jewish reincarnation that one could look at. Now, reincarnation has been posited also as a possible answer to the issue we discussed yesterday about why do the righteous people suffer? Why do bad things happen to righteous people? One of the answers is this is a payback for the sins of a past life. So that's sometimes offered as a partial solution, which I believe, Lahavdil, Buddhism basically says the same thing about suffering. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
What's the difference between kosher Passover food and the kosher stuff that we eat normally, like on a daily basis? Like what makes it kosher for Passover?
Oh, okay. Very, very simple. There is year-round kosher. Meat has to be slaughtered a certain way. You have to get rid of blood. You can't use certain portions of the animal fat. Right? That's standard kosher, and that applies when it's not Passover, and that applies when it's Passover. Okay. However, for Passover, we have to avoid bread and leavened products. That's called chametz. Now, chametz can come in all sorts of forms. Bread is chametz, cookies are chametz, unless they're kosher at Passover. So when something is corn syrup can be chametz, starch can be chametz. So when a food is certified kosher for Passover, that simply means it does not contain any fermented grain product that would be prohibited. So I'll give you an example. Coca-Cola. In fact, some non-Jews only buy Coca-Cola during Passover. Why is this so? Because Coca-Cola is normally flavored with corn syrup. That's much cheaper than cane sugar. Original Coke used to be cane sugar, and now most sodas are high fructose corn syrup. But since corn syrup, at least, cannot be used on Passover, so when they make kosher LePesach, kosher for Passover Coke, they go back to cane sugar. So for kashrus reasons, in order to be certified. So if you are an aficionado of Coke, you will prefer the Passover Coke because it has sugar instead of the non-Passover Coke that has high fructose corn syrup. Same thing with a lot of products. Ketchup. Regular ketchup. Again, I mean, basically the concept is high fructose corn syrup, which by the way is very detrimental to your health, but it is much, much cheaper than sugar, and it has replaced sugar in virtually every product. Passover, all of that is replaced. So essentially, what you got to tweak the ingredients list to be sure you don't have starch and those types of syrups.
So milk, so there is no like kosher for Passover, we can drink the regular kosher milk, right? Okay, so let me explain the issue. There is an issue of kosher Passover milk for the following reason. It comes from the same cow, and it's just milk. But the problem is, cows themselves eat grain, and the grain is fermented grain, so it's chametz. So there is a concept that you shouldn't take milk from a cow that ate prohibited chametz. So if it ate before Passover, its milk is okay. So really, what is kosher Pesach milk? All that means is it was milked before Passover. Because if it was milked during Passover, I buy it during the week, then if the animal produced the milk by eating prohibited chametz, the milk would be prohibited. So basically what I would say is, if you buy your milk before Passover, you're going to be okay. Now, one exception. A lot of milk is fortified milk with vitamin D. Vitamin D is produced by a grain malt extract. So it's not the milk that's not kosher Passover. It may be the grain additive that's not kosher Passover. So that's why you want to be sure that additive has not been put in. Same thing with chocolate milk. Chocolate milk has obviously additives, right? You don't have a chocolate cow that produces chocolate milk. And the additives may have malt in it, and malted barley is chametz. Okay, but you're right. So milk per se is milk, but there are additives, so there are going to be problems. Okay. Any final questions? Yeah.
So Torah is handed down from God, and it's God's word, which makes sense. Talmud is written by rabbis.
Yep.
It contains commentaries of rabbis.
Yep.
So how do we accept the words of men, maybe intelligent and holy men, but men as the word of...
Yeah, that's a very excellent question, and I'm not going to tell you the Talmud is the direct word of God. It is not the direct word of God. However, it is the word of God as mediated through human intelligence, and here is the point. In the book of Deuteronomy, which is still the word of God, God basically said that the Torah is to be interpreted by the rabbis of the succeeding generations. And let me give you a simple example from the American Constitution. We have the Constitution, which is the ultimate authority, but the Constitution is interpreted by the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court says the Constitution means something, we are bound to follow that, because that is the very system the Constitution sets up. Now, objectively, the Supreme Court might be wrong. In other words, objectively they're wrong, but systemically they're right, because within the system that the Constitution set up, the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of the meaning of that text. In other words, God has delegated the interpretation of his will to this process. So it's not that the actual words that are being articulated by this process are the words of God, but they have been legitimated by the command of God as creating the authority structure that we follow.
So, theoretically, I guess outside the system, the rabbis could be wrong.
Yes, but what's interesting is the following. Robert Jackson, who was a justice on the American Supreme Court, once said, "We are not final because we're infallible, but we are infallible because we're final." By that, I mean the following. Objectively, the rabbis could be wrong, but it is the will of God that their decision be conclusive. Because otherwise, you would not have any authority structure. Meaning, the Talmud actually gives us a story about this, in which the rabbis were debating a point of halacha, and one rabbi was not convinced by the majority decision. And he kept on trying to make his case, and he actually had miracles. And he had a voice from heaven that said, "This rabbi is right, and you guys are wrong." And they told God, "Keep out of this. The Torah is not in heaven. You have entrusted us with the responsibility of interpreting your will. You yourself," this is the Talmud says the story, "you yourself are bound by this interpretation." So what that means is something can be wrong in some metaphysical sense, but it becomes the operational truth by which we're supposed to live our lives, and God is said to go along with that process. That is the meaning of the Torah is not in heaven. The Torah was left to the human interpretive process. It's a complicated idea, but the way the commentaries explain it, the truth of Torah is not like a mathematical truth, in which there is only one answer, 1 + 1 = 2, and if you say 3, you're wrong. But rather, the Torah is a truth that is the culmination of a process. And if the process is conscientiously followed, and of course that process is complicated, by the people who are qualified to engage in that process, which is also a complicated question, then God blesses the results with the imprimatur of truth, even if in some objective way it might not have been correct. Yeah.
So then why isn't there a level of pragmatism in that some of the teachings that people learn now are not treated with the same legitimacy as the Talmud is?
Well, that is far from an easy question, meaning what makes the Talmud such a final repository of Judaism? That's a very, very difficult question. Now, part of it is the tradition that we have that's been handed down, that the generations do descend in spiritual awareness, not necessarily IQ, but in spiritual sensitivity and attunement to the will of God. Maimonides actually develops an idea, which is pretty revolutionary because it's a bit unique, that the authority of the Talmud stems from the fact that the Jewish people as a collective body, it's like ratifying the Constitution, accepted this as the definitive statement of the halachic principles, and everything else has to be derived. In other words, according to Maimonides, it is essentially the same as the ratification of the Constitution, meaning this became an act where the Jewish people as a nation accepted this as binding based on their recognition of the greatness of these sages. But it's well. Let me put it this way: it is axiomatic that the Talmud is accepted as definitive, but the theoretical foundation for that is not at all clear. And again, it would be much easier for me to simply tell you every word of the Talmud comes from God, but that would not be that honestly would not be the case. It would not be the case. And the reason why I can prove to you it's not the case is when you read a page of Talmud, you have one rabbi talking to another rabbi. Now, if you're going to say this was handed down from Moses, then you'd be turning a conversation into a script reading. In other words, somebody gave Rav Hillel a script to say to Shammai. Clearly, these are people that are talking to each other. They're using human reasoning. So we have to say the following. The Talmud is based on the principles of the Torah, which are divine. It is based on God's revealed will. And it is based on the fact that God wanted his will to be interpreted through the human efforts of these scholars. And that becomes God's will, even if objectively it's incorrect. Let me leave you a homely example to illustrate this. Let's say you wanted to make a cake for your 4-year-old. So the easiest way to do it is when the child is asleep or the child is in nursery, you make a cake. The cake would be neat, the kitchen would be clean, and you'd have a nice cake, 20 minutes. But a deeper way of showing love is by inviting the child to make the cake with you. Now, when you make a cake with the child, the cake is not going to be so good. It'll be lumpy. The kitchen will be a mess. Part of it may be burnt. Part of it may be underdone. There'll be an eggshell in the batter. So you could have done a better cake by yourself. But the love inheres in the interaction and in the relationship. God could have given us a Torah in which every single thing is spelled out. Microwave ovens, cloning, nuclear war, all the halachic issues that we debate and we argue over. God could have given us definitive answers. Why have a Talmud which is full of debate and ambiguity and discussion, and this continues to this very day with new questions? Answer: God could have made the whole cake himself. But in his love, he wants to make the cake with us. We become the co-creators of his will by interacting with his materials. So that's why I don't think it's irreverent to say that the Talmud is messy. It is rigorously and precisely logical. But it's messy. It's full of ambiguities, full of complexities, full of different ways of looking at things. And people are confused when they start learning Gemara because they say, hey, why isn't this telling me a bottom line? Well, if you want the bottom line, the Talmud is the wrong place to look. Talmud is not about bottom line. Talmud is about interpretive possibilities, about creativity, about logic, about seeing the multiplicity and the infinity of possibilities in approaching a problem. But that's a pretty messy way to give a Torah. God could have given us one answer to every question. But he wants you to bake the cake with him. It'll be a messier cake, but it's a more meaningful one. So this is the idea of the oral law. The oral law, as we call it, is not just like a relay race in which we're transmitting a huge amount of information from God, although there is a core of information that indeed is directly from God. The oral law is interactive, dynamic, creative. It is the human attempt to understand the will of God and apply it to the new situations that arise. The new situations that arose in the Talmud and the new situations that arise today, every day. The Torah doesn't change, but life changes. And we have to know how to apply those timeless principles to new situations. But God wants us to be the ones that are engaged in that process. So it is very, very tricky. You are 100% correct. The Talmud as a word-for-word document was not given by God to Moses in that form. Obviously, it was written down, but it is ultimately based on the will of God. And therefore, it is a divine document in that sense. Okay, anything else? I think we're about finished. Anyway, it was a pleasure learning with you, and I wish you a lot of hatzlacha. Come back often.